Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for this week's TKC briefing. We're joined as usual by Geoff. Next time we might actually have Andrew with us. He's kind of tied up. The idea tonight, of course, is to tell you about what we've been doing. And in later parts, which we'll release as the week goes on, we're going to have a little chat about aircraft carrying ships and are they aircraft carriers? And how does that develop? And maybe are they even relevant today? And finally, we'll have a wee look at the current conflict in Ukraine again, because we seem to love just going and having a look at that horror story. But we're actually going to try and come up with some ideas as to whether or not it's relevant to look at World War I and World War II in the Eastern Front and try and get some idea why this isn't going quite to plan for everybody. Anyway, World War I. Geoffrey's the man's been dealing with it. Geoff, what have you managed to get through this week?
Right. In terms of research for our board game, I have been going through the French Navy in the Atlantic and by extension their service in the Mediterranean. And I've been noting up what ships are where and effectively creating a picture where the French deploy a fair number of protector cruisers and some armored cruisers in the Atlantic, which are later utilized for escort work. But generally, the French are very much a minor power when it comes to Atlantic work. This obviously is part of the Entente Cordiale. The British patrol the Atlantic, the French patrol the Mediterranean, etc., etc., etc. But while I've been doing that, I've been sort of just touching up some Royal Navy destroyers and making sure they're much more accurate, thanks to an excellent website, the Dreadnought Project, which looks at destroyers moving by month rather than every 6 months, which is what my previous sources had. So really, if there's one thing that I have learnt whilst looking at all of this, it's that the French have a very interesting problem in that they are just coming out of an extended period of what is known as the Jeune École, where a number of very bright, very clever young French naval ministers and officers decide, what if we tried building lots of small ships with torpedoes and tried to force the British fleet to come to battle, and then we sink all their battleships? This has a certain amount of relevance when certain guns are slow firing enough and there's lots of powder blinding the British in gunsmoke. But eventually that gunsmoke is reduced with smokeless powder, and those torpedoes are very vulnerable, which means the French have a lot of cheap ships and they've got to work on building proper battleships again. Cut forward to World War I, they're still only just pushing that program forward. So they're very much outclassed by the Germans, and they know. They've got to put the majority of their stuff in the Mediterranean to face the smaller Austro-Hungarians. And if the Italians had swung on the German side, then that probably doesn't even bear thinking about, to be perfectly honest.
Well, to be fair, whenever you and I have looked at the French, it does, to me, look rather like a collection of experimental hotels that happen to have guns stuck in top. And I can see, you know, the is it the von Tettenkopf or whatever it is, class of Austrian dreadnoughts, whilst maybe not ideal, and in some ways very similar to the ships built by the Imperial Russians, with, you know, triple turrets, 12-inch guns, blah, blah, armour plans which are somewhat lacking in comparison with the dreadnoughts built in Northwest Europe, largely by the British and the Germans, and also by the US Navy. And let's be quite clear about that. US Navy dreadnoughts actually are quite well screwed together. As was shown at Pearl Harbor, when so few of them actually were completely destroyed, you know, with a substantial airstrike there.
This will be very relevant when we talk about air power. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, that said, the Med's a fairly big place. I know there are some Royal Navy ships kicking about in it, particularly by the time the Dardanelles kick off. We send quite a lot of stuff, including some fairly modern ships, to try and force the Bosphorus, but that doesn't go very well. Is this weakness in French ship design something which we need to really worry about in downrating the units, or is it something which, simply put, everyone's really got it to some extent with the earlier ships, and by the time, say, the British and the Germans and maybe the Americans get their act together, it's not a problem.
Right. That's a tricky one, because in some ways you probably could say French ships are inferior, but you don't need to do any down rating simply because they've got dreadnoughts. Sorry, excuse me, they've got pre-dreadnoughts and semi-dreadnoughts. So you will all automatically see in the way those ships are organized. You know, they won't have. They might have some decent fire control. I do need to check. Thanks to Stephen S. Roberts, very, very good book, if you can see it right there.
Oh yeah,
But the one thing, the fact is, nonetheless, when the French have pre-dreadnoughts, their pre-dreadnoughts seem to suffer the same problems as everyone else. You know, you hit it with a mine or a torpedo, and boom, goodbye. So I will look at the semi-dreadnoughts and the dreadnoughts themselves that the French eventually get around to building to see if there's anything useful there. But
well, I can tell you at least one of them had a very bad day at Mirza al-Kabir in 1940.
Absolutely. Yeah,
but then again, I don't. Generally speaking, when you design a battleship, you design it to be proof against its own guns for some reason. Because obviously everyone's going to shoot at it with guns the same caliber. Unfortunately for the French, the British shot at it with 15-inch guns, and it was armoured against 12 or whatever it was inch guns that it had been originally built with.
How do you say ouch in French?
Kaboom. Just kind of what it did, unfortunately. A lot of French guys died. Yeah. This is always the problem. The other thing is, given the Austrians, and actually some of the Italian dreadnoughts were not great either, in terms of their armouring and so on. It costs a lot of money to build a ship that does everything fairly well. And if Jutland taught anybody anything, it was that whilst the British battle cruisers, which arguably were armoured to armoured cruiser level, not to barrel wagon level, maybe didn't do all that well because of failures in drill, and certainly the I-class ones were not that heavily armoured in comparison to the size of the cannon getting shot at them. Even so, the bottom line is the two battle lines took a pasting, especially the Germans, and got home. Right? And there's some evidence that the Austrian ships may not have been so lucky in that event. The Italians may not either. And there's a couple of instances in World War II, and I have to look at World War II for this, because I don't know enough. In fact, there wasn't really any combat, including between the Austrians and the Italians at sea using the heavy stuff for the most part, from what I understand. But it's entirely possible the French might not have been so badly outgunned as you might think, on the basis that the local competition wasn't that good.
Tricky. On the one hand, the Italians and the Austrians do have a fair amount of experience from beating each other up in the 19th century. And I'm really not sure. This is why the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians and the French not really going at each other in World War I is so frustrating. You just don't have enough data to say. And the other thing is, when I was looking at British and German gunnery practice 2 years ago, there's a fair amount of information on it. And the Germans start off with assuming they're going to be fighting at 8,000 yards, and then World War I happens, and then they somehow sort of reality kicks in very quickly for them before any shots are fired, and they realize, oh no, we actually have to practice for far longer ranges in the Baltic. And the British going, right, how accurate are the Germans? Here's how accurate we are. Blah 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 blah. I've constructed a picture of their gunnery, and to a certain extent, with the Russians and the Ottomans, I can now construct a picture of their gunnery, because the Germans will get shot at by the Russians, and they'll go, oh, their firing was quite good. Well, very good is 50 yards spread with a third salvo straddling at 15 to about 15,000 yards. So from that, I could say that Russian gunfire is probably 4th to 5th salvo straddling with 100 yards spread at 10,000 yards or something like that.
Yeah.
There's nothing like that for the French or the Italians at all. No gunnery practice, nothing.
The only
I
place
believe
you
I'm
might
wrong.
get some data from for that is Gallipoli. It's the only place I can think of, because I know that the French sent their old battleships, or some of their battleships, to support the landings.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
What's it? And that's something we'll have to come back to at some point. So there's a wee thought for you.
Yeah.
I'll have a wee go at what I've been doing this week. I decided, in my wisdom, to install Windows 10 on a Windows 7 laptop earlier this past week. That turned into a mission. And it wasn't a mission from God. It wasn't the Blues Brothers, unfortunately, because it wasn't funny at all. It didn't bloody work, in fact. So what we had to do is we had to phone our head programmer up from here in Blairgowrie, and he's down in Tunbridge Wells, and I could actually hear the swearing without using a telephone. I'm quite surprised if you didn't hear it, everybody, because I'm here to tell you it was a nightmare. Nothing went right. And effectively, we ended up with a corrupt Windows 10 installation, which I had to redo. And we ended up with some of the bespoke software that we used to do the games, particularly the map editing thing, just didn't work. And we need that for the software project as well as for the actual board games that you know that we produce. So here's me speaking to Microsoft in one hand, speaking to the antivirus people because it's whitelisted, it should be working fine, blah, 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 and the other. I've got Bob talking to me down the phone. He's controlling the laptop, whatever. And this takes 3 days. And the third day, Bob lost his rag and said, "The hell with this. You shout at Microsoft. I'm going to shout at the software elsewhere." And after an all-night session, which managed to really annoy his wife, "Sorry, Helen, we didn't mean to upset you," he sent me a file, installed it, and the thing worked. And what it was, he was able finally to take our partial source code and properly reverse engineer it. So we now have full-blown source, not just for the computer game, as was, but also for the map editing tool. So we can get that to work, in theory, in any computer that will still run 32-bit code. So it'll run on Windows 11, Windows 10, Windows 7, XP. It might run in Vista. If someone's got an old Vista machine, it should work in that, because all XP is, and Vista are basically all the same core. So the reality of it is, it's a huge step forward. Then, Bob's got a really powerful workstation PC, as you can imagine, being a programming guy and a computer gaming whiz. His machine's not slow. It's a 13900 KS. It's an RTX 4090 on it. It's got 64 gigs of DDR5 RAM, and it's running Windows 11. And he was compiling something in the background, as you do when you're doing stuff for another client. And the map editor decided to, he uses a word which is a bit more crude, but it decided to collapse. Let's just put itself in on itself. In the process, it took out his machine. Major hassle for him to recover it. Knackered the compile that was working elsewhere. And this was actually with a fixed version of it. So he was like, this is not on, there's obviously a bug. So he did another all-nighter because he needed to recompile the other project and try and work out why this had taken down a whole computer, when it actually worked just fine in mine by that point. So he found that there are serious memory handling concerns with the way the original software was done. So he's cleaned that up. And his parting shot on Friday, before he popped off to see his parents in the north of England, was, "Give me a list. Stuff you must have, stuff you want, stuff you'd like," in the editor. So I gave him a list. And then he said, "By the way, let's try that game again. Just make sure it's working." So we got that open. And what I didn't realise, he's still in control of the machine. He just wasn't utilising it. And to cut a long story short, we very quickly worked out that the editor is a key component of creating the computer software, because it enables us to set side ownership of terrain. That's vital. We've also identified how the coordinate system for unit location works, and we've decoded a lot of that. We've got a couple of things we need to do with unit values, and understand how that's assessed and handled within the software. But we're at a point where Bob's fairly confident that in a few months' time, we can complete logic insertion in what might be best described as a gamma version, get that to delta, which would be something which is possibly not as stable as we'd like, despite the fact we think it is now fully stable. I'm sure when we bugger about with it, it'll go unstable. And actually get it working 32-bit with all logic working. Once that's done, Bob and I are pretty convinced we can then tease apart the XNA element, the old 32-bit environment that it was built in, take that out and replace it with Unity. Now, that sounds easy. I can assure you it's a nightmare. But if we can get that to work with both the editor and the game, we then have everything running in 64-bit modern code with fully functional logic and the ability to much more simply manipulate the data sets within the product. Now, Geoff was talking to me a wee bit earlier on this evening. He wants us to be able to essentially suck data out of a spreadsheet. Now, we think, and we're not certain, but we actually think that CSV files are a way to go with this, Geoff. I know that from past experience with it, various evil and malicious things are done to the Word files we use to create the actual board game OBs that you get within the boxes, because they have XML code in them, so you can actually suck the data out. Now, that's one for us to discuss with Bob, and then maybe do a wee video about how we're going to do it, but it should be possible from the Word files to actually essentially generate, at the very least, the key component data for units and their locations at start in a game fairly easily. All right, I'm just going to say fairly easily. It won't be simple as it sounds, but I believe it can be done. In fact, I know it can be done because it has been done previously. So an awful lot has been done this past week. Geoff, as you know, has been really busy with the French Navy in World War I. I've been incredibly busy swearing at computers. I've also managed to get about just over halfway through the full sea zone map for Madagascar 2. I really have to just put weather zones on it, but there's quite a few weather zones to plug into the thing, and it's not done in the editor. We export a different scale for the sea zone maps, and then I use a bunch of other mapping tools, usually Corel, to be honest with you, and Corel Draw, and overlay information on it so you get what you're used to if you've seen our sea zone mapping. So that's effectively what we've done in the last week. I also, by the way, had a chat with Corey, our head researcher. I hope you're all thinking positive thoughts, because this time tomorrow, Corey's going to be strapped to a bed with a machine moving his leg backwards and forwards with a new right knee. So he's getting that done at some point tomorrow. He has given me all the information that he can assess and assemble and put together for World War II Croatian forces. I said that was on the way last week. We have it now. He and I have analysed it. We've had a chat. We've discussed maybe getting rid of some counters and just amalgamating some junk units into something you could use. So that's on my to-do list, is to complete the artwork for Balkan Fury, which means amending the Axis OB file and then change maybe, I think, 3 or 4 counters and then add quite a few, to be fair. And that will actually get that game properly to proof in its entirety. There's not much we can do with it when you're stuck swearing at a computer and then managing to screw up your head programmer's machine. Anyway, so we have now provided Bob with a very nice bottle of scotch for coming up with this fix. It's really important. We're really excited by it. You may have noticed the odd news article going out, the odd thing going up on YouTube, the odd email from our mailing list, and the odd thing on Facebook about this. It's that important. It's huge. If we'd had this in this condition when Bob came on board about 2 years ago, we'd probably be at a point where it's in Unity functioning with prettier graphics by now. That's his assessment. I don't disagree. As the guy who architects the software with him, I'm horrified it's taken so long, but we are making huge progress now, which is so exciting. So I'm going to love you all and leave you at this point. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about what's going on with the French Navy and whether or not we need to play with it in World War I. You maybe understand a bit more about the nightmare that we had. And by the way, that laptop is kind of working. That's all I can say. It isn't working properly. There's still something a bit wrong with it. Some of the nightmares that we've had with IT and the massive leap forward that Bob losing his temper, being honest about it, had, because it pushed them to get something done that couldn't be done. And all of a sudden it is done. So for those of you struggling a wee bit out there at the moment, try harder. Lose your rag with it. Push at it. Try something a bit different. It will help. Things will get better. For those of you who are just wondering how you get a project done, this is how you do it. Sometimes you get a setback. That setback can suddenly become a really positive thing. You get a massive jump forward and you're like, wow, this is cool. So thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, click like. If you didn't like it, click dislike. Either way, please comment and follow us because there's more to come. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.